When these women in polygamy become blindly obedient and they do everything they're told, it isn't long before they themselves become perpetrators of crimes. Because they are obedient, they give their 12-year-old daughters or younger to men to wife. Because they're obedient, they take their 13-year-old sons or thereabouts, throw them out of the cult, out on the street with nothing but the clothes on their back, maybe $5, maybe less. This is what happens with blind obedience to narcissism. Irene, tell us some of these stories.
Well, I've seen over and over where children had to go out and work to help support their father's families. My own sons went out and worked from the time they were like 15 years old and gave all their money to their father so that he could marry more and younger wives. Many polygamous families that I have seen, and I've had the kids come back and talk to me years later, said how they resented their fathers making them work and putting the responsibility on them and the guilt trip that they would put on them. And then these very people that worked to serve their father and to help him get ahead were the very ones that were kicked out and put out so that they couldn't get wives. And in fact, they'd say that you needed to go to the outside world to get your wife. You couldn't have one in the cult because they belonged to the brethren. So these young boys that didn't know how to cope on the outside anyway were told to go find them wives and convert them and bring them back into the cult.
Because some of them were so isolated, they didn't have much personality for doing that.
Exactly. They didn't have an education. They didn't have social lives. Really a sad thing.
Of course, that didn't apply to all of them. Some of them were fortunate. According to John Llewellyn, in the AUB, the boys that stay in polygamy are usually the sons of the favorite wife that had the best hierarchy in the family because they could see that they benefited through the labor and the subservient life of everyone else.
I can see that. Yes, I can see that.
And especially the sons of subservient wives and secondary wives had great contempt for their fathers, and they got out. The boys actually, some of them got out, some were thrown out, some ran away. But the girls, they had the hard time getting out, no matter who they were born to, because they were the breeding stock that kept the cults going.
Exactly. And that's why how you were measured with your worth is how many children you can have. That's what I've seen over and over. In meetings, they would get up and tell so-and-so to stand up and say, this woman has given birth to 25 children. You ought to follow in her footsteps. Look what she's done. She's not let a year go by without having a baby. Well, you know, I was producing them as fast as I could. I had 13 children by the time I was 34 years old. I was worn out, had varicose veins, had medical problems, and yet it was expected to just have one more child.
One more child every year?
Yeah, one more child, one more. But here I had 13. They want you to have another one. And if I hadn't have taken my own life in my own hands and gone and had my tubes tied, why, I'd have probably had 8 more kids.
What's the largest number of single births that you've seen a woman have in polygamy?
22.
That's pathetic.
Single births.
That's pathetic. The women are actually trafficked back and forth between all of these cults. That all of these leaders of all of these polygamous cults claim to be the only one that's true and they're God's mouthpiece on earth, because according to their religion there can be only one. Is that correct?
Yes.
But they have no qualms about giving their daughters to their buddies in another cult and sending her off to another cult and maybe get some daughters from the other cult for themselves. They feel nothing bad about that, but the child, the girl, when she's sent into another cult, frequently loses all contact with her family, doesn't she?
Oh, I've known girls that were married off when they were 14 and 15 years old that went 20 and 30 years without seeing their families. And in my case, I had some of my own siblings that their husband wouldn't allow them to come and visit the rest of the family. I went years without seeing some of my sisters. My mother's, you know, my dad's wives, went years without seeing their own daughters. And yes, it's the norm. It's not just here and there, it's the norm.
So when a woman is given into marriage, she's a commodity, just like a cow or a goat. She's literally given to a man, sometimes for power because he's a high-ranking official and they might get daughters back. But she is literally given away, and she belongs to that family, and her family, she's done with them. She's not accepted anymore because she belongs to the wrong cult.
Well, we are actually taught that we were the man's property, and he can do what he wants with it. If he thinks we need to be whipped, we can get whipped if he thinks we deserve it. I know one man whipped his wife so hard she could hardly walk and couldn't even take care of her kids for a couple of weeks. Or she went to her father. Her father said, well, maybe you didn't deserve it this time, but just take it for the next time and figure that you had it coming. But they don't even defend you. They figure if a woman gets whipped, that you whip her into submission is what you're doing. You whip her and chastise her because you love her. They will whip you and say, don't you know that I'm loving you? This is loving you. I'm shaping you up, you know?
Well, they're taught that it's okay to kill somebody you love to save their soul and eternity so they won't go to hell, so why not whip them? What's the difference? Except they're still around.
I've heard of, and I've seen many a woman get a beating until she could hardly walk.
Well, I've read stories on the internet of people down in Colorado City and whatnot that were literally locked up in a shed for days and days and beaten because they questioned.
Yeah.
They questioned. And how much trouble did you get into asking questions when you were down there in Mexico?
If you knew what was good for you, you didn't ask questions. I was questioning it all, so I finally came to the point where I just kept my mouth shut and just went along with it and was hoping that this life would soon be over and that I would be dead and gone and out of it. Many women just wish for death. They don't fear death, they long for it because of the pain that they're going through in this life, you know.
I've heard polygamist women say, not just once in a while, but often, I'll be glad when this life is over.
Exactly.
They look forward to death as a liberator.
Yeah. Death will liberate me. Yes, exactly.
Children that grow up being told that they have no right to think, that all the decisions will be made for them, can never learn critical thinking. They don't know how to make decisions. So they're in bondage not only to the sick minds that hold them in slavery, but they're in bondage to their ignorance because they don't know how to cope with an outside world. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and I was taught all my life, the brethren made the decisions for you, they thought for you, because we were too stupid to make it, and they had to be right. We had to make the right choice. And one of the biggest mind openers in my life came when I found out that I had the right to be wrong. Never ever had that concept in my life. But I had the right to be wrong. I had the right to think for myself. And if I didn't think exactly like somebody else, and even though I had to stand alone and I didn't have their acceptance, it was a good feeling just knowing that you made that choice.
I've talked to a lot of people that were raised in polygamy that grew up believing if they made a mistake, they were a mistake. There was no differentiation between the mistake and the child.
Yeah, if you made a bad choice, you were a bad child. You were a bad person through and through.
Right, so you had no opportunity to redeem yourself from an error, and yet there's no such thing as a person that never made an error.
Yeah.
Utterly impossible. Because we learn by mistakes, but not if you're going to be beaten, chastised, disowned. You don't dare to think. People don't understand why these women and children don't just leave. They don't know how to survive. They never learned. Well,
they haven't thought for themselves. They have no skills so they can go out and get a job. In fact, when I used to leave Mexico and go out to San Diego on a rare trip once in a while, I felt like I was in another world. I couldn't cope with society and having people see me. It was actually frightening. I felt like that they were judging me. And we had been told that don't go out into the world because they'll destroy you. They're Satan's, soldiers, and they will get you. And so you live in all this fear. You don't know how to speak to people. You don't know how to express yourself. And it took me to go to Toastmasters and learn to be able to get up and speak at Toastmasters and overcome my fears. And the first time I ever went there, they asked you to tell something about yourself, and I got up, and it's the first time to an outsider that I got up and admitted that I had been living polygamy and admitted the truth of my life. And I was so frozen with fear that I could hardly speak. And I thought that these people were going to judge me and that it was going to be a terrible experience. But you know, when they clapped for me, and afterwards these people came and hugged on me and loved on me, I realized that all that I had been taught during my life were lies. That there were people out there, that human beings that will love you for who you are and accept you if you will just have the courage to be yourself.
I wonder if Toastmasters International will ever realize how many people they've liberated by offering the opportunity to speak.
I used to be so frightened as a child. I could not go into a store. I would look down, I would be horrified, afraid people were looking at me, and I could not change a $5 bill. And now I've gone out, I speak at universities and places of abuse and at schools and anyway, all kinds of stuff. And I don't care if it's 100 or 3,000 people. I don't fear at all because I know who I am. I apologized all my life for who I was, and I don't have to anymore. I can just be me. Well, I've had people say, oh, I feel so sorry for you, Irene, that you went through what you went through. And I tell them, don't feel sorry for me. All that I went through has given me the compassion, the insight, the love that I might be able to help other people. And my biggest joy is when I get all these emails from people that have come out of polygamy, that people that are living polygamy or their husband's getting ready to take another wife and they don't know what to do, and I've been able to help them. And had I not suffered what I had been through, I would not be able to understand these people. Through my life, God has revealed my purpose.
That is beautiful. A lot of people do not understand that post-traumatic stress disorder is not only a battle fatigue for our soldiers, but it is common in fundamentalist polygamy. Not just FLDS polygamy, but Islamic polygamy, African polygamy, all across the world, all types of polygamy, where men have all the power and women are just objects to serve and to sexually be there to have children by or to please.
To gratify a man.
Yes, and the abuse level in human beings is always in direct proportion to the distance between the empowered and the disempowered. Therefore, there is a huge number of women in polygamy and in other forms of sexual slavery that suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. People that have a nervous breakdown and depression is much higher. You've seen a lot of that, haven't you, Irene?
I have seen so many plural wives that go around just trying to cope, and they'll even admit to you they're just trying to get through the day. Some of them are trying to get through the next 5 minutes, some in the next half hour. You go through the day so overwhelmed because you're taking care of all these children and feeding them and trying to clothe them and mend their rags so that you can take care of them and keep them going. And you become so overwhelmed and hopeless. And I noticed all my life, wives, whether they're plural wives or the first one or whatever else, they will sleep their day off if they, if it's not their day to cook or something, they will sleep all day long. And they just live trying to block their minds out so that they don't have to cope with it. I've seen women have nervous breakdowns, and I've seen the children that have had it. Like I say, I've had 9 nieces and nephews and 1 first cousin that committed suicide. And it's heartbreaking when you see what religion has done to these people. Your husband come home and say, hey, I'm taking you with me tonight. I'm getting married tonight and I want you to go, so get ready. I actually went to 4 of my husband's weddings, if you can imagine. I took the bride's hand and placed it in my husband's hand and gave her to him so that I could earn my way into heaven and that I could be accepted by him. And if you don't think that's hard, it actually tears your heart out to be there. And you have to keep a smile on your face because the people there are judging you, and they will say, oh, Irene doesn't have an inner. Did you see her? She has a bad spirit. She didn't have a smile on her face. So you go there and you smile, and in the inside you're saying, oh, God, just help me not cry. God, don't let a tear fall down. God, just help me, help me, help me. It's emotional abuse in every sense of the meaning. And for a woman to have to put up with that is absolutely uncalled for.
Well, it's spiritual abuse as well, because they're using God to justify that behavior. They're using God to force a lifestyle on another human being that they themselves would never tolerate, not for a minute.
Well, you know, people say, why did you even go to the weddings? But I want to tell you, I wouldn't have ever had any more nights. I wouldn't have had him come to my house. I would have been taken care of as good of, you know.
You've been bad enough and it would have been worse.
Yeah, it would have been. It would have been. Trips were very, very few. They were far, far between. They would have all been cut back. You got what you got out of life according to your obedience. And if he didn't think you were obedient enough, then you got punished for it. Even if it wasn't a beating. My husband never ever beat any of us, I will say that. But many times I'd rather have a good beating than the emotional abuse that I went through.
They don't realize that psychological and emotional and financial and educational abuse are still abuse.
Exactly.
A lot of the women that had nervous breakdowns suffered post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think the saddest case was Lucinda, because she basically stayed in that body, but she never came back. Will you tell us about Lucinda?
It was my husband's sister, Lucinda. She became a plural wife. She actually had a nervous breakdown when she was 16 years old. And when she was about 19, they married her off one of the German brethren that was quite a bit older than her. He had a first wife. She had twins, a little boy and a girl, and a year later she had another little girl. So she had 3 kids right on top of each other. She didn't have her own place. She had to live in with the other wife. She just gave up on life and up on living. She absolutely lost her mind. I saw her locked in a room and like a prison, but it was terrible being left there for year after year after year. And finally, they took her out to the States and put her in a home in Arizona where she could be taken care of and have some love and attention, but she actually lived in this little shed like an animal. And it just breaks your heart to think that a woman can be put in there because she's just can't follow people's rules and because she didn't feel loved and because, you know, what happened.
Well, her reality became so difficult to bear that she simply left it. She had no desire to come back to it, because if she came back to it, she was damned for time and all eternity, or threatened with blood atonement. Isn't that true?
Yeah. Even her own father whipped her before, you know, she got married. He gave her some good whippings and trying to whip the devil out of her.
It's so sad that so many of those women that were pushed to the brink of depression were blamed for their own condition and told that they had the devil in them and punished. She wasn't the only one. There were a lot of them, weren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I served my husband. Like I say, I gave him 4 wives. I did everything he ever asked me. I took care of 20-odd children by myself. We didn't have a Costco to go to and all these nice things, no decent clothes or anything. I was just drudgery trying to just take care of these kids day and night. And when I had my nervous breakdown, he said, you know what, you never ever did anything I wanted you to do.
Whoa.
And I'll never forget, that was like hitting me in the head with a sledgehammer, because all I ever did is what he wanted me to do. And you know, it was a good thing that happened, because these things started waking me up. And I realized that I had put my life in somebody else's hands, and if I wanted a life, I had to take it back in my hands and hang on to it for dear life for whoever I was, even though I didn't know where I was going, what I was going to do, but I had to hang on to me. And I left my husband, and when I left him, I did not leave him to find another man. I left him to find me and find out who I was.
So you put your entire salvation and value in his hands, only to discover that you really had no value there after all.
But when he said, you know, you've never done anything that I've ever wanted you to do, I just thought, oh my golly, it's all I have ever done is serve and serve. And how many times he just didn't know I'd put a smile on my face. And, you know, he'd come in when he was going to a wedding, he'd say, hey, don't you let a tear drop. I want you to keep that smile on your face and, you know, set a good example here. He can't have people think he's got a disobedient life. So here I am just trying and trying, and at the same time trying not to have a panic attack. And that's another thing. I've seen so many women have panic attacks. I've seen women hauled off to hospitals because they're having panic attacks. I know 2 women. The one had a panic attack and the other one took her to the hospital. And when the second one got there, she ended up on the hospital floor with a panic attack because it was so bad. But that was, so they both of them had it. But
well, the second one ran a real high risk even taking her to the hospital. She was obviously in extreme fear.
And there's people that have nervous breakdowns, or people that are just coping with life. that they're not living, they are existing. Just barely existing. And like I say, trying to get through the day. And it's no way to live. And I say, you can see the pain in these people's faces. They can't tell you, oh, I'm happy. They look miserable. Their whole body exudes despair and hopelessness. And that's the thing is, the word hopelessness, there is so much hopelessness in every one of these groups. That's why it has led to so much suicide and
crime.
Yeah, and crime, and people suffering and going through what they do. And the next thing they do, and they start seeing you have a nervous breakdown, you either shape up or you'll end up being blood atoned. So you lose one way or the other.
These women are literally doing all this to make the man a god. He doesn't have to make him a god. They make him a god by tolerating this. I wonder if they realize that.
Well, they say if a man has 7 wives, then that qualifies him. And so women do everything they can to try to help him get at least that number. I would see these men that were supposed to live these holy higher laws come home drunk. They would come home with smoking, reeking with liquor on their breaths. And, my mother used to cry herself to sleep because my dad would come home that way. And yet here he's one of the priesthood people going to heaven, and she's going to help make him a god. And she would feel bad because he could buy liquor and cigarettes. And he couldn't buy her anything that she even needed when she was sick, anything at all to help her out. I remember people say, oh, don't listen to them, they're Olive's children. Like my mother was wrong and she was subservient, and whatever she did, she tried with all her heart to do what was right, but she didn't have a backbone, she didn't speak up, she didn't defend us, and she just was barely trying to cope with life. But it's just sad that even though she went through all of this, to the very end, she got right back into polygamy. She got sealed to a man for eternity. She wanted all of us in polygamy, even though she had suffered, because she felt that she was going to go to hell if she didn't.
I talked to her about that, and I asked her why, when she could see so many of the leaders doing so many wrong things. And she said, it doesn't matter if other people do what's wrong, you have to do what's right, no matter what. Their crimes don't make it okay. She couldn't accept the fact that she was in a cult. She was too terrified. She'd rather die suffering and take her chances than to face that wrathful God that had been hovering over her with a sword from the day of her birth in her mind. And she's not alone. I've talked to many, many polygamous women that were exactly the same.
And they keep education from you. They didn't, just like in Colorado City, there's no TV, there's no magazines, there's no newspapers, there's no books other than the few religious books that they want you to read. That happened with me. We had about 5 different religious books that we could read, but you couldn't read anything else. And so you don't know that there's anything else. Your mind hasn't been opened up to it. And they don't want you to know, because in ignorance they can control you. If you get a little, common sense and know what's going on, why you're not going to allow people to do this to you. So they keep you ignorant and barefooted and pregnant.
Well, I've talked to several people that dared to ask questions that were literally beaten for asking the questions. Yeah. Slapped across the face, slapped into the wall, kicked or beaten, literally. So you don't question the word of the Lord, and that word of the Lord means anybody that's bigger than you that said so.
Yeah. Well, they always told us from the time we were a child to do not betray the brethren. And betraying the brethren is questioning the brethren. When you see a man marry a little tiny girl that's just hadn't even reached puberty yet, and marry it, and you ask why this is happening, why, that's God's will. They found out from God that's who they should marry. Why are you questioning God? And something must be wrong with you. You're not humble. Get on your knees and pray and ask the Lord to show you that, this is great and wonderful. So then you start doubting yourself because, you tried using your brain. It didn't get you anywhere.
I've been told by some polygamous women that they actually made that mistake, and they were told that they had to fast and pray until God told them the same thing that they already knew, that what they were doing was right. So these women didn't get to eat anymore until they saw the light. And some of them didn't get to sleep hardly at all. And some of them, without the food and without sleeping, had tiny babies and were children to take care of, had nervous breakdowns from that very thing. They were literally denied sleep and they were fasting until they saw the light. Which is, you know, when you see it my way, you can eat again and you can sleep again. Until then, you cannot. I've had people tell me that, and I'm personally aware of one of them. I want to thank you for helping to educate people about what goes on under extreme narcissistic conditions. That the behavior pattern is not confined to fundamentalist Mormon polygamous cults. It is a typical behavior of polygamy worldwide, because polygamy is a narcissistic behavior where women do not have rights. They are property. They are lesser human beings. And of course there are varying degrees in varying groups and varying families of how far they're willing to carry it. But to protect women under these circumstances and get inside somebody's home is very difficult, because a woman cannot risk saying anything, because then she'll have no place to live, she won't be able to get her children out, she won't have a home to go home to. You can't stand up and tell the truth and run the risk of what's going to happen when you go back home. Isn't that true, Irene?
Most people don't realize that the men make the rules and all the children belong to the man. And so that's another reason what woman is going to try to leave and she can't take her children. First place, she can't support them and she can't take care of them. And when, for years, I was told, if you go out and get on welfare, because I wanted to leave and get out and I was willing to go and try to get on welfare. I was threatened, if you go get on welfare and they find out that I have all these children and all these wives, it's going to be your fault, because you will have me put in prison. These women are going to suffer and these children are going to suffer just because of you, because you wouldn't keep your mouth shut.
That's right.
So
I've had people tell me that.
You couldn't even go try to get on welfare, as frightening as it was. You were afraid that they would find out about it. Even when I had my nervous breakdown, he didn't care whether I had a nervous breakdown. He wanted me out of the way. I went to try to get help. They were going to give me help. He wouldn't let me. He took me and hauled me back to Mexico and got me back out there. Had no help whatsoever. And I wasn't to discuss it with anybody. And I went months where I was just surviving every day. My oldest daughter, Donna, had to take care of my children and my babies, and I could not function. I was literally dying emotionally. It's a miracle that I'm sitting here today and that I didn't end my own life and destroy myself, because I was in such a destructive situation.
When you came forward and you wrote your book, a lot of people read that and said, oh, well, that's a very unusual story. That's unique. That only happened to her. But your story, in truth, is a common story among polygamist women, isn't it?
Absolutely. If people only knew the nervous breakdowns and the suicides and the things that happen in people's lives, but they deny them, they shove them to one side, they try to keep it quiet. It's not talked about because they can't be wrong. They're God's holy people. And boy, we don't mention those kind of things.
Well, polygamy is a great moneymaker, enslaving that many people, trafficking your daughters, the tithing they pay, the free work they do for the Lord, the government funds that they're eligible for, the taking a church and organizing it into a corporation out in the boonies on the land. Then they become eligible for schools, roads, post office, whatever. And they become extremely wealthy. And people don't seem to notice. They don't notice because very few people have had the courage to speak out and tell the truth about what's happening in America today. Well, you've done a great deal to change a great number of lives, and I personally want to thank you for what you have done.
Thank you.
You're welcome.